Okay, thank you. Okay, so today we are starting with the first of a six-part series of webinars. So this whole program is being run in partnership with the Mid Southwest Economic Engine, Carbon Fit, and Innovate UK. We will be looking at six webinars in all, which will, I suppose, really build a series, a stackable series for you, which should be really useful in your journey. We'll talk about that a wee bit more in a second. But just to give a little bit more context as to how that fits into the program overall. So this program, which is being run in partnership with the three councils across the Mid-Southwest region, which will be Armagh, Banbridge, Craigavon, Mid-Ulster, and Fermanagh and Omagh areas, seeks to support micro enterprises and SMEs within those three key areas who are operating within three sectors, especially. So we're looking at advanced manufacturing and engineering, agri-food, and construction. And the three key areas of support that are available through this program include the webinars, which we are starting out here today, our breakfast meeting series, and one-to-one support, which will be provided directly by the Carbon Fit team. Just to provide a little bit of context on the Carbon Fit team this morning, although if you have any questions, we have Anne-Marie Roddy here today, who is Carbon Fit's Associate Director and who will be leading this morning's webinar. But Carbon Fit are a team of chartered engineers with over 20 years experience who have developed software to really help address the issues that were being faced by clients when it came to trying to simplify the carbon reporting journey. So they have utilized both their expertise and their skill within this area, but also advanced technology to really help businesses and guide them along on that journey. So whether they are just starting out, like yourselves maybe, on a net zero journey, or looking to create a carbon reduction plan, whether they're looking to accelerate that journey through net zero, or maybe look at certain elements such as their supply chain, Carbon Fit will be able to find the right solution to solve all of those problems for you. So again, if you have more questions on that, please do keep those towards the end for Anne-Marie and the team, or feel free to put them into the questions. Also, what I would just add is, in terms of the breakfast meetings, although there are three in all, there are two still left to run. We have the next one, which will take place in Craigavon on the 5th of September. And then there will be the last in the series, which will be held on the 17th of October. All sessions have the same format. They will run from 9 a.m. until 11:30. And will also feature a range of speakers from local businesses, service providers, and finance providers as well. So a really great opportunity for you to really get that direct engagement and find a wee bit more out on that wider journey and what that might involve for you. You can register for any of those events, the one-to-one support, or more of these webinar sessions directly via the website. And the website would be the midsouthwestregion.org/net-zero-transformation. So as I mentioned, I said we would come back to it. This is the first in a six-part series. The idea of these webinars today is to really help you, to guide you on your journey from really understanding, well, what is net zero, which we will cover off this morning, to sort of start to delve a little bit deeper on that carbon auditing process, what that might involve, maybe setting targets around that for your business, how you would go about engaging your partners, looking at renewable technologies that might be applicable to your business, and how you go about continuing to monitor that as you move along. By the end of this journey, you should have something really, really practical and tangible that you can use to help guide you on your journey towards net zero, and also developing an action plan. But don't forget, you will also have access to the Carbon Fit team, who will be able to help you along the way there as well. the agenda for today. So we've already done our introductions. As I mentioned, today's session focuses on net zero in particular. It's quite a large area to initially get around. So what we'll be looking to cover off today, and again, Anne-Marie will give you a bit more information on that, but it will be an introduction to net zero, a background to what exactly a carbon footprint is, as well as looking at things like carbon neutral, net zero planning, and why that's important for businesses as well. When we have gone through Anne-Marie's slides, we will then have something a little bit different. We'll be talking to Una Barrett, who'll be our local case study, and that's from Barrett's Concrete around Dungannon, so a nice local case study. They'll be able to tell you a little bit about their own experience of their net zero journey and what it's been like to work on the programme. There will be an opportunity to tackle the first couple of activities, which again, Anne-Marie will take us through, and then we'll have our interactive Q&A session at the end. So please do feel free to write down all of your questions as you move along, and we'll get a chance to answer those all towards the end. So Anne-Marie, I am going to hand over to you at this stage. Please feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Janelle. And thank you to everybody who is joining us today on this lunchtime seminar, just to run through what is net zero, the first of 6 seminars that we're going to be running. And I know we have a lot of the companies who've signed up for the one-to-one on today to learn a little bit more, but we also have a range of companies varying through all sectors with us. So we're delighted to have you today. And my aim is to keep on track and on time so that we do have time at the end for questions, and maybe hopefully a little bit of time out of that hour that you have 10 minutes to get out for some fresh air today. But if we jump right in, so the definition, what is net zero? Net zero, we have a couple of definitions here. So it means cutting greenhouse gas emissions as close to zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere. Or another way of saying it in terms of an organisation would be net zero is a sustainable strategy that ensures no additional greenhouse gas emissions are added to the environment. And what is the aim of net zero? Really, it's to limit the global warming by 1.5 degrees. So a lot of words. Can we really understand those definitions without understanding terms like greenhouse gas emissions, or why the aim is to limit it to 1.5 degrees? Possibly not, which is why we're going to just delve a little bit more into the details of some terms that you'll come across quite often when you hear about net zero. So if we just go back in time a little bit, we can see it starts even before 2008, and terms such as carbon emissions, climate change, all of those are not new terms. They actually date back. And we can go back as far as the 1800s, believe it or not, where the level of carbon emissions were actually first measured. And in 1859, a scientist you may have heard of, John Tyndall, identified the potential for climate change due to the increase of certain carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and that the actual temperatures in our atmosphere would rise as a result of these emissions if they started to increase. He basically essentially noted that it would cause heat from the sun to become trapped because of certain gases within the atmosphere, and would increase the sea and land temperatures. So that was back in 1859 where that was first actually established. Now, as we know, since that time period, a lot has happened since then, and that is exactly what's happened. The temperatures have started to increase, and the emissions of those gases, greenhouse gases, which we'll touch on in a second, have also started to increase. So in 1988, following on some 100 years later, the IPCC, so that's the International Panel on Climate Change, was actually first established. And they first reported in 1990 that global warming is likely. Then in 2005, the Kyoto Treaty came into effect. And then fast forward to 2008, the UK government actually produced a world first framework and legislation that set out UK's approach to climate change, and to set a target for 2050 and a reduction of lower emissions by a 1990 baseline. So that was the first real policy set in place by the UK government back in 2008. So as you can see, this has been around for a long time. We know that it's been coming, but the pressure is now definitely mounting with the last 10 to 15 years as we see the effects and we see the evidence of the climate change now occurring. If we go forward then, just in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted by just under 200 parties at COP21. It was the first legally binding agreement, and it did state to keep global warming within 2 degrees, but also to pursue a limit of 1.5. To follow on from that, 2018, the International Panel on Climate Change stated in a special report, which they were commissioned to carry out, they were commissioned to carry this out to review the increase in the emissions, which had already taken place, which was expected at that time to be a 1 degree change. And they were then commissioned to examine the expected changes between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees and the effect that that would have on our ecosystems, the weather, our food supply and health if we did reach 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. And that policy and report stated very clearly we must reach net zero by 2050 in order to avoid the worst cases of climate change. In 2021 then, COP26, it was a very important year. G7 confirmed a global commitment to net zero by 2050. And the EU also set in law a climate law to basically set in place that 2050 again target to ensure net zero is reached. In that year also the SBTi, which is the Science Based Targets Initiative, was launched, and it launched a guidance and basically set out targets and a framework on how to help businesses and organisations in various sectors reach net zero by 2050. So that was very important also, and we touch on that again through a few of our webinars. In 2022 then, obviously COP27, the governments joined the Net Zero Government Initiative to develop a roadmap to net zero. And then in 2023, we do see public sector guidance coming out from the likes of the UK government, the NHS, and they all publish guidance in terms of, you may have heard of the PPN06 guidance, which is you have to have a carbon reduction plan in order to tender now for certain frameworks and contracts with the UK government and NHS. And then even into this year, then we see the recently updated Climate Change Act here in Northern Ireland. And then in 2024, we will see further climate legislation and reporting requirements coming into play. And again, that term of net zero coming in by 2050. So there is a waterfall effect continuing here now, whereby you as small SMEs or larger companies will be asked by companies who are reporting to the public sector, the UK government, to then report to them in terms of your emissions. So that's where the waterfall effect comes in. It does start to affect even the smaller companies. So we understand a little bit now about net zero commitment and that 1.5 degrees, but there's other definitions in that net zero definitions such as greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll just touch on that. Next slide there, Danielle, please. So in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but what are greenhouse gas emissions in the greenhouse gases in the first place? So there's a range of gases, as you can see here on the slide. So go from carbon dioxide, which is emitted through transportation, fossil fuel combustion, right over to methane, which is in landfill and agriculture, nitrous oxide, through to the manufacturing. So there's a range there. But what happens is, because carbon dioxide is the largest gas in that collection, you'll often hear, instead of greenhouse gas emissions, you hear carbon emissions. And it's kind of collectively put into one term, wrongly, and mostly wrongly, because you can't do a full carbon footprint if you don't collectively combine all those greenhouse gases into your calculations. And I will come back to that. So you'll see terms like CO2, which is your carbon dioxide, but you see also the term CO2e, and that is the equivalent. So it's basically all of those different gases collected together and calculated together. So when you see the E, it means those collection of greenhouse gases. And I suppose one other thing that we've come across this before is, what is 1 ton of greenhouse gas or carbon emissions? Well, if you just picture, let's say, a hot air balloon, that is actually a good way of visualizing it, because that is 1 ton of carbon emissions. So if you're calculating your carbon footprint and you come across, right, I have 100 tons, it's easier to visualize, I think, because sometimes people just haven't an idea of what that is actually physically looking like. So that is when we're talking about greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, essentially that's what we're referring to. So, okay. Yeah, no, go ahead, Danielle, go ahead. So another term yet again, carbon footprint. So again, it's interplaced because your carbon footprint is actually your footprint of your greenhouse gases. So it measures your total greenhouse gas emissions caused directly or indirectly by your organization. It measures the total volume of a number of greenhouse gases, which we've just discussed, and it is typically expressed as I mentioned there, the ton CO2e equivalent. So you're basically, even though it says carbon footprint, it is a measure of all those greenhouse gases, which is made up, as we said there, of direct and indirect emissions. And it's very important to understand your total carbon footprint, because without it, the term net zero doesn't really matter, because you can't get to net zero without knowing what that number is in the first place. So your carbon footprint is essentially the first thing you'll do in terms of your net zero journey. So if we go on to the next slide, I just want to explain a little bit more about what direct and indirect emissions are, because again, these are all terms that you're going to come across as you start your net zero journey. So Scope 1 emissions is essentially your carbon company facilities. So in your company, if you basically have heating or gas in your heating, and you're using oil in your heating systems, that is a Scope 1 emission. Okay, so you'd have to collect that information and understand how much natural gas you're using, for example, in your company facilities. Another topic that falls into the Scope 1 is refrigeration. So if you have air conditioning in your building, it would be how much refrigerant you're actually using in those air conditions on an annual basis. So this is all collected on an annual basis, typically within your last financial year. The other one that falls into your Scope 1 is your company vehicles. So it's the fuel used in the company vehicles owned and controlled by your company. So it's the emissions associated with that. So when you hear people talking about Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, Scope 1 emissions is essentially your heating, your refrigeration in your company facilities, and what fuel you're using in your company vehicles or processes. Scope 2 is indirect. It's actually your electricity purchase. So it's the electricity you're using on site for those processes of heating and cooling, and basically to keep your operations open, essentially. So they're the main two. So when people talk about net zero, they typically start with calculating Scope 1 and 2 emissions first, and then they will move on to Scope 3, because as you can see here, Scope 3 is quite complex. You have 15 categories in Scope 3 compared to maybe 2 or 3 just in your Scope 1 and 2. So just to touch on very quickly, the Scope 3, you could be talking about your employee commuting, which is an indirect, your business travel, waste, your purchased goods and services. And I will touch on purchased goods and services because it is most likely the reason your clients may be asking you for information on your carbon emissions, because essentially your carbon emissions are part of their purchased goods and services and fall into their Scope 3. So when they're doing a full calculation, they will need your emissions in order to basically include it in their Scope 3 calculation. So when your clients are now asking you, can you now basically give us your carbon credentials? Can you tell us what your carbon footprint is? This is why they're asking. It's because they're essentially trying to do their own carbon footprint and calculate their full carbon footprint, including their Scope 3 emissions. Okay. So if we go back again and just read that again. So what is net zero? Net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We know what the greenhouse gas emissions are now. So basically you're going to calculate what the total number of greenhouse gas emissions are in your organization. And then you're going to reduce them as close to zero as possible. So basically you're going to reduce that electricity. You're going to reduce that natural gas. Maybe there's an alternative gas out there. You're going to start looking at the renewables, and you're going to start basically putting other options in place that do not basically emit carbon emissions. Yeah, essentially that's it. We all know now why we're trying to aim to the 1.5 degrees, because if we go past the 1.5 degrees, we are going to most certainly see a lot more of the climate change that we're already seeing at the moment, with the floods, the droughts, the high temperatures, and definitely the change in the weather patterns that we're seeing at the minute, as put forward by the IPCC report back in 2015. So I think, and I hope that gives a better understanding of what is net zero and what net zero means for your company, and why UK government and other EU governments are now setting a net zero policy for their own countries, and putting that pressure basically down the line onto organisations such as that to also get to net zero, because it's a collective pathway and nobody's going to get there on their own. We're all on this journey together. Okay, Danielle, the next slide there. So now that you know what a net zero actually means, what does it mean to actually, what does it look like to get there? So this is a trajectory of a typical net zero journey. So it's broken down, as you can see, into maybe 5 and 10 years. So your total emissions, you're trying to decrease those within 5 to 10 years. And as I mentioned before, most companies will start with their scope 1 and 2 emissions calculation, and they will put a target on the scope 1 and 2 within 5 to 10 years, because it's easier it's supposedly your direct emissions, so it's easier for you to control your operations. In terms of then moving out to 2050 and ensuring you're in line with the 1.5 degree pathway, you would probably set a target for your scope 3 emissions by 2050, if not sooner, so that you are basically moving along with your supply chain, you're moving along with your employees in terms of employee community, you're reducing your waste, but you're setting that target in place and you know how you're going to get there. So essentially, year on year, you're reducing your emissions in line with the 1.5 degree pathway. And this, just for your knowledge, it's taken out of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And it's, as I say, one of the best ways to review how to set targets and how to realistically manage the carbon emissions reduction year on year. So that is just a typical, as I say, trajectory. Set your short-term targets, set your long-term targets. You can break your scope 1 and 2 up into one target and your scope 3 into another, which will help you understand and the company move forward into that trajectory. Thanks, Danielle. And I just want to touch a little bit on about what is carbon neutral, because I know, speaking from people at the last breakfast event, there are people on the carbon neutral journey. It is one way to move forward on it. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of things here. So the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. Carbon neutral means counterbalancing the carbon emissions from your carbon offsets or carbon sinks. So you would measure your carbon emissions and you may then purchase carbon offsets to offset your own carbon emissions. It may result in little reduction. I say may because not everybody does this, but it's just something to be very aware of, that if you do go down the carbon neutral route, you should always ensure that you're reducing your own operational emissions as well. So you're looking back to those scope 1 and 2 emissions and reducing them and moving on to your scope 3. You're not just calculating carbon footprint, going off and purchasing carbon offsets, because you're not essentially going to realise that 1.5 degree pathway that is what we're all striving for. And the other important thing to note is the term carbon neutrality does not always include your full carbon emissions, and that's CO2e. You may be missing some of your GHGs in that calculation. And this is just another trajectory. So this might be what a carbon neutral trajectory looks like. So again, this is a good example of one, because they are reducing their carbon emissions year on year, even though they're carbon offsetting, they are essentially reducing their own emissions year on year. Another way this can look typically is basically this doesn't change and people will maintain that same carbon total right across the years, but continuously offset. As I say, that is what we're trying to avoid, because you're not going to reach that 1.5 degrees limiting is what we're trying to look for here. And if anybody's any questions on that, please do ask at the end. Okay, so I think we understand now what the term net zero is, what maybe a potential pathway looks like. And now we need to understand, why do organizations need a net zero plan? Apart from the obvious, we're all trying to avoid climate change. And the other obvious one might be that you're actually trying to meet legislative or reporting requirements and you're obliged to do it. But there are other benefits to basically completing a carbon reduction plan. So the competitive edge, recently the British Chamber of Commerce stated that only 11% of the people that responded to their survey actually completed a carbon reduction plan. So by having a carbon reduction plan and a net zero plan in place, you actually have the competitive edge over those competitors out there who won't have that going to clients and basically been able to provide that information straight away. The second reason is environmental and social impact. So again, the increase in requests for ESG and carbon credentials for clients and tenders. I know from feedback from our own clients that this is becoming more and more common, that large, let's say, retailers right down to basically those who are doing just tendering for government work, you need to have those ESG credentials. And you need to understand what your environmental and social impact is. Not only as a company, as I say, but going for those tenders and being able to answer to your clients what you're actually doing about this. Energy and cost savings speaks for itself. Once you know what you're using in your energy, you can then identify potential cost savings. We had a heavy manufacturing client recently. We identified 66% in carbon reductions and potential savings of 500,000. So there's grants out there, there is funding out there to implement these energy and cost savings projects. So absolutely, why wouldn't you do it? To attract investment. Again, when you're going for investment, now 80% of investors are actually looking for these credentials as well in order to make their investment decisions and future-proofing your business. As we've seen before, it's just making sure you have a resilient supply chain, you know how your goods are coming into you, and that is a secure and future local supply. Brand positioning, again, 79% of corporate executives observed strengthened brand reputation after they committed to decarbonisation. There is plenty more reasons and benefits to getting on this net zero journey and having a net zero plan to hand and on your website to hand out to your potential clients. But if not just us saying this, we do have evidence behind this. Danielle, if you want to go to the next slide there. This is just another example. The British Business Bank did a recent survey, and if SMEs agreed with what we're saying, and 95% absolutely yes. It enhances its business reputation and brand. 73% agreed it kept them competitive. 66% gain and retain talent and employees, which is seen definitely among the younger employees coming through. They're already asking these questions from organisations in terms of what they're doing in terms of ESG, in terms of their net zero commitment. And another slide there, Danielle. In addition, they're seeing the positive effect in responding to the customer priorities and government policy, with 77% there to gain a reputational or competitive edge, or 73% basically responding to customer priorities, which I think is probably the main here that's coming through from our clients also, is just to ensure they're maintaining business as usual. So now that we understand all of that, I'm hoping that Una can give us a little bit of an insight into how she's found her journey, and a little bit more maybe on some of the terms that we talked about there. And thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anne-Marie. Hi, Una, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me today.
Welcome. Thank you for coming along. Una, we are delighted that you're able to join and share a wee bit about your own journey. I am going to give you a few questions, but I think it would be nice for everybody if you wouldn't mind just giving a wee bit of an introduction to yourself, the company first, just so everybody gets to know you.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Una Barrett. I'm the carbon associate for Barrett's Concrete. It's a family business. We're based just outside Dungannon. That's where our headquarters is. And we also have another depot up in Ballygawley. So we manufacture concrete products for the construction industry and for the agricultural sector. We're growing from strength to strength, I'd say. We're a third generation business now at the minute. But yeah, we recently started on our net zero journey with CarbonFit, and it's been really great so far.
Fantastic. And I know that it's a tricky industry as well to try and focus in on. What were some of the key drivers? What was the reasons behind you wanting to get involved in that net zero or sustainability journey?
I would say the reasons are probably twofold. The first being the rising cost of energy, which I'm sure everyone can relate to. We just had to look at a way. The costs were getting too high, and there was savings to be made. So possibly not from the environmental standpoint. The first one was cost. The second one was changing client requirements. So we do a lot of work with both public and private sector contractors. What we're finding from the public sector contractors was that they are being asked for this by their clients. They have to be able to demonstrate that their supply chain is on board with net zero. Otherwise, they're not going to comply with government legislation. So definitely that was one of the key drivers, that our customers are coming to us now asking, do you have a carbon reduction plan in place? What's your 5 or 10-year plan? What evidence can you provide us on a product level, but also at a corporate level?
Yeah. So as you say, there's always plenty of drivers out there, and it will vary a lot from business to business. But I think actually a lot of businesses are really starting to focus in on this from the perspective of cost savings, because there's just so many savings really to be made, especially at a time when profit margins are so tightly squeezed. Um, I would be interested in knowing, how have you found the journey so far? What have been some of the areas where you find most success, but equally, have there been areas that you would maybe flag up that you find more challenging?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people that start in this journey, scope 1 and 2 emission, understanding that is straightforward. It's basically just all your bills over the last couple of years. It's when you get into the scope 3, that is where our challenges have been. In terms of scope 1 and 2, we've been able to identify really quickly the savings that we can make. It then justifies any investment that we have to make up front, and the payback period for a lot of like renewables at the minute is pretty short. So that's been great, and it makes the business case without having to talk about sustainability. If it's not top of the agenda for everybody, we just do it on the cost basis. But when we came to scope 3, in terms of the products that we were procuring, so one of our main products that go into the products we sell on is cement, and cement is renowned as one of the biggest carbon emitters globally. I think it's 7% of all emissions are from the cement industry. So trying to work that we quantify that, we understand what it is now, but putting a plan in place that if we have to meet net zero by 2050, what is actually feasible in the short term that we can do there? And it's engaging with the supply chain. It's finding out what they're doing at the minute, sort of corresponding our plan with their plan. And a lot of the cement manufacturers within Northern Ireland are doing so much already. They've kind of been really pushing the industry. The other thing then just is around like employee commuting and business transport, trying to get those figures where there's not sometimes easy enough data to obtain. We had to do surveys with some of our staff. We had to do, a lot of estimating. So we followed the greenhouse gas protocol, obviously, with that, but it was difficult. You're not always 100% certain on the figures. And trying to get that really accurate baseline, I think, is so important for when you do start target setting.
Yeah, and you've actually touched on a couple of things there that I was going to raise. Like when you sat down to try and decide to go on that journey, obviously there's lots of different elements to keep in mind. Did you break those down into short, medium, long term, especially when you mentioned things like investment? For a lot of people, investment elements would be more of a longer term goal. Like how did you go about breaking that down? What were maybe some of the as they say, low hanging fruit that you were able to tackle right away compared to what's on the agenda as you move forward?
So one of the main ones we were looking at, and Anne-Marie actually mentioned it, was that there's grants available at the minute. So the fact that they're out there, we can justify a slightly larger upfront investment when we're getting up to 40% grant funding against it. And it means then within 3 years, we've paid back on like our solar system. And therefore the savings after that then justify any future investment. We can kind of ring fence them savings into a pot and say, that's what we then do to tackle the next issue that we come across. Low hanging fruit was just, I think once people see a cost and carbon figure, they start to understand what you're talking about. So when you're looking to make small changes, we were talking with the drivers, and it was, how efficient is their lorry being ran at the minute? Is there any time when the lorries are being ran that they don't need to? They're sitting idle. And we were looking at that, and they're small wins that only seem important when you monitor them over a year. So for a week, it didn't really make any difference. We weren't going to see any reduction in diesel. But when we monitored it over a longer period of time, we were seeing those reductions. And when you put a cost against that, it is incredible what you're able to save. I think also you have to empower your staff and bring them on the journey with them. It's not something you're forcing on them. It's something that you want them to do. And then the hope is that they'll take that back to their personal lives, and they'll be doing little things in their own house. So if they see us putting solar on in the office, then that's something they're going to consider within their own house as well.
Yeah, and on that, actually, also touching on your previous points about all of the different stakeholders.
Yeah.
That stakeholder engagement piece is so important. Like, how did you go about figuring out who all of the stakeholders were, trying to get that data from all of those different people along your supply chain? How did you find that? How did you go about that?
It was definitely interesting. We were looking kind of at the past 2080 framework, and part of that talks about mapping the roles and responsibilities and who the stakeholders are. So once we started doing that, we found that a lot of people were already talking about it. So with our supply chain, they were already on board with this. Maybe they hadn't got a plan in place, but they had their targets. They were thinking about this. Everybody was already considering it. When it came to our clients, they were the key driver. They were already asking for it, and we were saying, well, we're a year away or whatever. So if they have new projects coming through now, we're able to provide that certification and that documentation to them. We know that we've future-proofed our business for the next 10 years in terms of the frameworks that they're working within. The staff then, again, it's about talking about carbon in a language that people understand. So for the likes of the transport manager, carbon wasn't something that was on their agenda, but the cost of fuel was. And when you break that down and show them the figures that represent what they're doing, it makes a lot more sense. The other piece probably is around education and engagement. So we have like our own little carbon literacy that we were rolling out to staff, just little bite-sized chunks. So nobody was forced to kind of sit in a classroom all day. A lot of them would be against that. So when you start doing that and doing the little education pieces, people understand why you're doing it, they buy in. And then I think they do get that sense of empowerment where they see something in the news now and they say, oh, well, I actually understand what's happening there. When I hear the term net zero, it's not something totally far away from me. It's something I can understand and do something about.
Yeah, yeah. And then, on that, again, it's just a quick sub question because I know that there's a couple other wee questions I have for you here as well. But they talk about you can't manage what you can't measure. Like, how did you go about setting your key performance indicators, or what have you decided that you want to work towards? What's your goals?
Yeah. So the first step was just getting that baseline data. And I've worked with CarbonFit, and Anne-Marie and the team have been brilliant on that because before that, yes, we had information across like the accounts department or across different departments, but it wasn't really collated in a way that was understandable by everybody. So the first step was just to collate all that evidence, get a really good baseline, and then look at what was actually manageable. So like you said about the low-hanging fruit, those little engagement initiatives had to happen first before then we could set a really robust target. So the scope 1 and 2 is our main focus in the phase 1 of this approach. And it's about how much solar can we actually get on that we cut our electricity down to almost zero. So that's really key. It'll also take away a lot of our scope 1 fuel emissions in terms of diesel generators for parts of our site that are off the connection line. And we have kind of a 5-year, 10-year, and then the longer term plan isn't in place yet because we're trying to see what way the industry is going to go. There's so many technologies that aren't even available yet that we'll be able to use in 10 years that could totally change what we do, that could make it completely different. So we're looking at what's realistic at the minute, ensuring that the investment's there and ensuring we have the buy-in and that our clients are happy, we're fulfilling their requirements, and our staff are happy as well.
Brilliant. And actually, you talked there about working with CarbonFit and how amazing you have found working with Anne-Marie and the whole team, really. What, just out of interest, like what features or benefits have really stood out to you? Like what has been the most beneficial to you in terms of the services that you have received?
Just whenever you log onto the dashboard, your entire year of data is just sitting there in a perfectly readable graph, which is amazing because when you're so used to looking at Excel spreadsheets all day, seeing a visual like that, it makes the data so much easier to understand. You're able to track cost against carbon, which again, I think is so important for businesses. It is kind of the fundamental driver for a lot of things. Whenever you can track how much your fuel has increased over the last 2 years, how much your electricity bill has went up over 2 years, and then the carbon impact of that, when those savings start coming in against both costs and carbon, it makes it all worthwhile and it makes the business case for future investment and initiatives. But also the carbon reduction plan, we can go on straight away. Our baseline data is just converted into a carbon reduction plan that's available. And we have all the certificates as well that are just available to download. Everything is stored within it. As well, the team are brilliant with CarbonFit in terms of they're always at the end of an email or the end of a phone. If you have a query, if you have a recommendation for something you think could be done within the software. So I'd been working with Sarah and she was amazing. She was really receptive to any comments or questions I had.
So really it comes down to just, it's the perfect mix, really. It's been simple to use. It's provided a wide range of benefits and really the team just couldn't be more helpful. So that's quite a good trio there to work with. In terms of any future plans, anything else that you would like to add? I know you've talked a lot about where you are now, where you're going. Is there anything else that you would like to flag up as the future for Barrett's Concrete?
Yes, we're looking at our PAS 2080 certification at the minute, and we're also looking at our EPDs as well for our products. So that's kind of something coming again from the contractor side and working with our clients. That's what they're requesting, and it's kind of where the industry's going in terms of concrete products. So that's next on the agenda.
Brilliant. And just to round up, have you any pieces of advice, any tips or hints that you would share with people who are on the webinar here today?
Yeah, don't be intimidated by the likes of net zero and everything. And again, if sustainability is not your fundamental driver, don't worry that it is cost, because we're all trying to run a business at the end of the day. Find your why into this, and if it is cost, try and maximize on that you really drive down your cost, but you also drive down your carbon in tandem.
Yeah, and I suppose actually that's a useful one as well whenever it comes to talking to the stakeholders, is figuring out what their why is as well and speaking their language.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Una. That has been really, really insightful and has really helped support what Anne-Marie has been sharing this morning in this session. Let's see, can I ask firstly, is everybody still able to see the slideshow?
No, Danielle.
Yeah, there was a wee, it played up a wee bit there for a couple of seconds, and I'm going to have to try again. For a wee moment, it just completely disappeared altogether.
While you're doing that, can I just say, I appreciate Una saying everything there. That's just, we love to hear that feedback. And what I would say, if there's anybody on this webinar today, or anybody that's looking back on this webinar in future, being that it is recorded, phase 2 and phase 3 of the one-to-one assistance is now open. So if you're interested in receiving that one-to-one from Carbon Fit and our team and getting access to our dashboard for 12 months, make sure you sign up, and we will be going through that link at the end. But you've already called out the MSW website there at the start. So just to reiterate that again, get on and get signed up for phase 2 and phase 3.
Check. Can everybody see the activity workshop slide now?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Perfect.
I will let you carry on, and I will continue to monitor any questions, whether that be for Una or for Anne-Marie. I see we do have something here, but it's more a comment than a question. That's fine. Anne-Marie, would you like to carry on then with the activity?
Yes. So this is, you'll find this in your activity workbook that you will have received. And if you haven't received it, don't worry, it's on its way to you if you've signed up late for today's webinar. So the first, if you just go on to the next slide there, Danielle, please, question that we're going to ask you is, lovely. And again, it touches again on what Una was saying there. Out of the reasons to complete a carbon reduction plan or net zero plan, it's really just to get you thinking. Just put the list in a number of one, starting with the number 1 being the most important, and then rate them. And you can add to this. It might not be the reasons and benefits that we have put down on this, but it really is, again, just so that you can understand why is it that you want to set a carbon reduction plan in place or a net zero plan in place, so that you know the why, and that reason is basically just going to be reiterated every time you speak to someone within the organisation of why you're trying to get this done. Why is it important to your business in order to do this now? So that is the first one. The second one then is, set a goal in terms of net zero. And this can be just, if you're just doing the 6 webinars, it could really just be what you want to get at the end of it, what goals you want to set in terms of your net zero organizational goal by the end of the 6 webinars, or it could be by the end of the year, or it could be just, I just want to understand a little bit more. It could be anything, but just try and use the SMART technique, which is being very specific about it. Is your goal measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant to the why of why you're doing it in question 1? And put a deadline on it so that you know exactly when you need to reach that goal by. Again, it just helps with that engagement piece within your organization, with your stakeholders and with your clients, of what your actual goal is to reach net zero. So I think they should be, well, I'm saying it's easy enough. If you really get into it and start thinking, it might start to become a little difficult, and you'll get some really great insights into what you're trying to do. The next one then, Danielle, if you just go to the next slide for me, is what are the current barriers you face to achieve net zero? So that might be what, you know, even reflective on trying to get the data from different places. That could be a barrier at the minute for you. It could be time and resource that you are the person that has been given the responsibility to do this, but you actually don't have the time or the resource or the knowledge to do it. And you will need assistance. It could even be that you kind of do have the time and resource, you know exactly what you're doing, but how are you going to do it? Is there grants and funding out there to help support the projects put in place, or even the training that you may need from in terms to get this moving in terms of your net zero plan and your carbon reduction plan and your targets and all that goes with it. So what are the current barriers you think you face? And again, this is just, it'll be feeding back in the next webinar, and it'll also then just be, again, so that you can engage with different people in your organization. Say, look, you know, we really want to get this done, but at the minute, this is some of the barriers. How are we going to address these? Perfect, Daniela. The next one. Yep. So this is going to tie in with the next webinar, which is your carbon accounting webinar. So we would really just want you to think about now, what are the sources of carbon emissions that are applicable to your organization? So if you remember that image that we saw earlier on with the scope 1, 2, and 3, we're looking at your scope 1 and 2 here for the moment. And that is going into, as we remember, the heating, the refrigerants, your transport, and your electricity. So just mark down yes or no. Does your organization use natural gas? Yes. LPG? No. So just go down through that, because you're going to use that table then on the next slide, Danielle, to basically do a bit of an activity prior to the next webinar. So for when you come back for the next webinar, we want you to have a little bit of information. We want you to basically find out from a bill, which is probably the most easiest. So if you can find out your electricity bills, get a copy of your electricity bills, get a copy of your heating bills. You may need to go to accounts. You may need to go to different departments. Start looking into who can help you provide this information and the type of information you need. So for example, if you take electricity, you're going to have the kilowatt hours. That's going to be on your bill. Don't worry about it if you can't pick out exactly which line item it is, because it's probably about 20 line items on the bill, because we'll be going through that the next day in the next webinar. How to read the electricity bills, how to read the gas bills, how to extract that information in order to do a carbon audit and start calculating your emissions. So the activity really is then just go get some bills from the last 3 to 6 months and have them to hand for the next webinar that we'll be working through that. And I think that is it, Danielle. Yeah. Perfect.
Yep, that is us. So has anybody any questions that they would like to share? We had a couple, I was checking the chat, so we've had a couple of people who had to drop off. Thomas Ward, thank you for a great webinar. You're very welcome. A question for Una. 3-year payback with a 40% grant for the company. Ballpark, how many panels and batteries did that take, and what was the cost saving per annum?
Oh, sorry. I actually don't have those figures to hand at the minute, but I can pull them out and I'm happy to share them then if that suits.
Okay, no problem at all. Thank you very much, Anna. That's great. Thomas says that's great. Okay, anybody else any questions that they would like to ask before we wrap up today's session? No, it looks like we're all quite quiet. Well, in the meantime, if I could just remind everybody, we had a few activities there at the end. If you want a wee bit more time and want to recap on what those activities were, don't forget that you will be able to access a recording of today's session, assuming that Zoom has managed to do that correctly today. It looks like it is still recording, so fingers crossed. You'll get a recording of today's session, and just to take a few minutes, because all of those elements will help you build on your action plan and prepare for your next session. The next webinar, which will focus on carbon auditing, so that's looking at your carbon footprint, will be on the 29th of August. Again, it's a lunchtime session. And remember that you can register for any of the webinars, as well as the breakfast events and the one-to-one support from the team at Carbon Fit via the website midsouthwestregion.org/net-zero-transformation. I'll try and type that in if I get a second. We have another question here quickly. Do you collaborate with academics who are interested in net zero research? That's Obi Martins.
Is that for me? Yeah.
It isn't. Obi, could you say who that's for? Is it for anybody in particular, or? I'm not getting anything through, just for Carbon Fit.
Sorry, Danielle, and just recap, that's do we collaborate with academic institutions?
Yeah. Yes. Do
Yeah.
you collaborate?
No, I was on a conference.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. There we go. Sorry, it's yes. Do you collaborate with academics who are interested in net zero research?
Yes. Well, I suppose the only thing I could answer there is, we have collaborated with the likes of Queen's and Ulster University in taking in students. I'm not sure if that's what they're referring to, and academics who basically have come in and worked with us and done certain projects with us. So yes, we do collaborate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And then finally, just a comment from Roisin McCabe. Many thanks for an informative webinar and look forward to the next one. So I think that seems to wrap up all of our questions. Can I just say thank you very much to Anne-Marie and the Carbon Fit team for today, and also, of course, to Una for sharing her insights on Barts Concrete's experience so far. So other than that, I would just say hopefully we'll all see you again on the 29th of August. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. So, thank you.